Sarah unlocked her quiet little shop in Vermont, expecting nothing more than dust and creaky strings. But when she opened the old violin left on her counter, her blade caught on a hidden panel. Inside a folded slip of paper, strange symbols and a silver insignia of an eagle clutching arrows. Her breath caught. Then her phone buzzed. "No caller ID, Ms. Whitman," the voice snapped. "Secure the violin. Do not leave. A federal team is en route." She stared at the instrument. What had she just uncovered? And who exactly had brought it in? Sarah Whitman had spent most of her life surrounded by strings that hummed with the echoes of time. Her shop, Whitman Strings, sat quietly on the corner of a sleepy street in Brattleboro, Vermont, the kind of town where the trees knew your name and time seemed to linger like the scent of old wood. There was no flashy sign, no glowing neon. Just a hand-carved wooden plaque above the door, weathered by decades of rain and snow. It read, "Where old music finds its voice again." At 28, Sarah wasn't the kind of woman people noticed right away, and she preferred it that way. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who understood the value of stillness. Her denim shirts were always worn in her brown leather apron stained with the dust of old violins. But what struck people most wasn't what she wore. It was her eyes. Calm, focused, as if she could hear a sound that no one else could. Sarah's love for music wasn't something she stumbled upon. It was something inherited, something sacred. Her father, Walter Whitman, had been a military musician, a trumpet player for the U.S. Army Band during the Gulf War. He never talked much about the battlefield, but every night, like a ritual, he would open a scuffed wooden case, pull out his tarnished trumpet, and play a single song. Sometimes it was taps. Other nights it was America the Beautiful. Always short, always quiet, always full of meaning. Sarah would sit on the stairwell listening. She didn't always understand the notes, but she felt them. They were memories in sound. When Walter passed away unexpectedly from a stroke when Sarah was just 20, she inherited more than his trumpet. She inherited his tools, his stories, and his deep reverence for music as something more than just performance, as a kind of living legacy. Whitman Strings had started as a side project in her father's garage. Today it looked almost frozen in time. The walls were lined with violins, some new, most old. The air smelled of pine rosin varnish and aged wood. A single lamp in the corner cast a golden light over her workbench, where tools were arranged with surgical precision. Children often pressed their noses to the fogged-up glass in winter, fascinated by the instruments. Veterans would stop by to chat even if they didn't need a repair. Somehow the place felt more like a sanctuary than a store. Sarah never charged full price for children, and if a veteran walked in with a broken instrument, she refused payment altogether. "Music saved my father," she would say with a gentle shrug. "It's the least I can do." She lived alone just above the shop in a small apartment filled with books and forgotten symphonies. She never married. She said she was waiting for the right key to fit the lock, though deep down she wondered if maybe her life had already found its melody, one made up of quiet repairs, humble service, and the occasional miracle. To the townspeople, Sarah was dependable, kind, a bit reserved maybe, but always there. What they didn't know, what Sarah herself didn't know, was that one rainy morning a customer would walk through her door carrying not just an old violin, but the first note of a mystery that would change everything. The morning the old man walked in, Sarah was elbow deep in a restoration job, a 19th century German viola that hadn't sung a note in over 50 years. She didn't even look up at first when the bell above the door gave its usual soft chime. But the door didn't close right away. There was a pause, a presence, and then a voice soft, gravelly, worn by time. "Ma'am, is this where broken things get a second chance?" She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, hunched slightly from age, the way trees bend after decades of wind. His wool coat was faded, its collar threadbare and edges frayed. He wore a knit cap pulled low over his ears, and in his hands he carried a rectangular bundle wrapped in old gray cloth held to his chest like something far more precious than it appeared. Sarah blinked. Something about the way he stood. It wasn't just the weight of years, it was the weight of memory. She motioned gently. "Come in, sir. It's cold out there." The man stepped forward slowly, like each movement was calculated for balance, not speed. His boots were scuffed. His gloves had holes, but his hands, Sarah noticed, were steady and careful, like a man who had held fragile things his whole life. He approached the counter and unwrapped the bundle with surprising tenderness. It was a violin, old, worn down, its varnish cracked like sun-dried earth. The strings were dull bridged, slightly warped, and the scroll had a chip near the peg box. Nothing about it screamed value. But Sarah had been around long enough to know this was not a violin for show. This was a violin with stories. It doesn't need to look pretty, he said, his eyes not meeting hers. I just wanted to be able to play just once more. Sarah hesitated. Her repair schedule was already overbooked. Between 2 youth orchestra rehairs and a cello bridge rebuild, her next free day wasn't for another 10 days. I'm sorry, she began. I'm a bit full up this week. I can give you a spot next. Then she looked at him, and in that single glance something shifted. His eyes, gray and glassy, met hers for the first time. There was no demand in them, no urgency. Just a quiet hope. A worn-out kind of hope, like someone who'd knocked on 1,000 doors and wasn't sure this one would be any different. She swallowed hard. Let me take a quick look, she said instead, surprising even herself. The man nodded once and set the instrument gently on the bench. He didn't ask about price, didn't ask when it would be ready. He didn't even stay to watch her inspect it. He simply said, "My name is Frank D. Holden." She reached for a pen to jot down his number, but he held up a hand. No phone, no email. I'll be back in a few days. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind only the violin, the faint scent of winter air, and a ripple of questions Sarah couldn't quite name. She stood there for a while after the door closed, staring at the instrument as if it might offer some clue on its own. There was something haunting about it. Not just the scratches and the dents, but the way he touched it as if it was a part of him or someone else he cared deeply about. She ran a gentle finger across the strings. They gave off a dull twang, barely audible. Just once more he had said. She didn't know why the words stuck with her so deeply. Maybe because in her line of work, instruments often came in silent, but rarely had one ever come in needing to speak. Not just for music, but for something unfinished. Frank D. Holden. She repeated the name in her mind like a refrain. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't lingered. He hadn't even checked to make sure she would agree. It was as if he'd come to the right place and trusted her with something sacred. She took a breath, lit the desk lamp, and began to examine the violin. She didn't know it yet, but she had just opened the first note of a symphony buried beneath decades of silence. And the melody, it was about to change everything. Sarah had handled hundreds of violins in her life, some masterpieces, some barely holding together, but none had ever felt like this one. As she carefully laid Frank Holden's instrument on the worn velvet mat of her workbench, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to open something more than just an old violin. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Instruments carry emotions after all. That was normal. She began her inspection the usual way, examining the seams, tapping the plates gently with her knuckles to listen for weak glue joints. The wood was old spruce and maple, possibly mid-20th century, judging by the aging pattern. The fingerboard had been replaced at some point, and the bridge looked like a quick fix, not factory, but done with skill. Then she noticed something odd. The backplate felt heavier than it should. Not by much, maybe just an ounce or two, but enough for someone like Sarah to notice. Curious, she loosened the strings, removed the bridge, and gently began to open the top of the instrument. It groaned faintly like an old man stretching after a long nap. With care and precision, she separated the body along its original glue seams. That's when she saw it. Nestled within the hollow cavity of the violin's back plate, almost seamlessly fitted into a false wall of wood, was a small compartment no larger than a deck of cards. Her heart skipped. She reached for her fine pointed knife and slowly pried at the edge. The panel lifted, revealing a hidden pocket tucked deep inside the instrument. Inside lay 3 items. First, a folded piece of yellowed paper, delicate as onion skin, covered in neat handwriting, not in English but in German. Second, a small metal medallion no bigger than a quarter, with an eagle design she didn't recognize. It wasn't the familiar bald eagle of U.S. military symbols. This one looked older, European, fierce. The eagle's wings were spread wide, clutching arrows in one talon and a key in the other. The third item was the most confusing. A thin strip of laminated paper printed with what looked like military code, a series of letters, slashes and numbers, spaced in precise columns. At first glance, it resembled a cipher or a line from a Cold War-era encryption sheet. Sarah blinked. What in the world had she just uncovered? She gingerly set the items aside, grabbed her phone, and took a few high-resolution photos purely out of habit. She zoomed in on the handwriting. It looked like something from a World War II archive. Then the metal. She took note of the texture, the eagle's stance, and the fine engraving work. Finally, the code, which she assumed was either decorative or dangerous. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of war relic, spy memorabilia? A collector's prank? On a whim, she uploaded a few of the photos, not with the violin's full details, to an online forum. She often browsed rare European instruments in hidden compartments. It was a niche community of antique instrument lovers and historians. Surely someone would recognize the metal or the writing. She didn't even finish her tea before her phone buzzed. No caller ID, that was strange. She usually didn't answer those, but something in her gut told her this wasn't spam. She picked up. Hello? A pause, then a firm, authoritative voice on the other end, clip, direct American accent, no room for confusion. Ms. Whitman? Yes. This is a matter of national interest. Do not leave the shop. Secure the violin. A federal team is en route. Sarah went cold. I'm sorry, who is this? She asked, startled. But the call had already ended. She stared at her phone screen, now dark and silent. A low hum of panic buzzed at the back of her mind. She glanced at the violin, then at the strange artifacts spread across her workbench. Somewhere between the wood glue and the varnish, she had stumbled into a secret. And judging by that call, it was one that someone somewhere had been waiting a very long time to find again. It was just after 4 p.m. when the black SUV pulled up in front of Whitman's Strings. Sarah spotted it through the frosted glass of her storefront unmarked tinted windows. Government-issue wheels. Not the kind of vehicle that came through Brattleboro very often. Definitely not the kind of vehicle that parked outside a violin repair shop. 3 individuals stepped out. No uniforms, no guns, but their movements were sharp, coordinated, like people trained not to waste time. One was a tall woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and a clipboard. The second, a man in a navy windbreaker, carried a slim briefcase and looked more like a librarian than anyone official. The third, younger, mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, walked directly to the door and held it open for the others. Sarah stood behind her counter, instinctively pressing her hand against the violin case on the bench. The tall woman was the first to speak. Ms. Sarah Whitman. Sarah nodded. We're here on behalf of the Department of Defense. May we come in? It wasn't really a question. They were already inside. The younger man closed the door behind them and drew the curtain across the front window. Not rudely, just precisely. They flashed small credentials, not full IDs, but black leather wallets embossed with a Pentagon insignia. My name is Director Hensley, the woman continued, gesturing to herself. This is Dr. Calder from Intelligence Archives and Agent Mendez from Signal Operations. Sarah tried to steady her voice. This is about the violin, isn't it? Calder gave the faintest smile. Yes, ma'am, and more than you probably know. He stepped forward, carefully opening his briefcase. From it, he retrieved a tablet and after a few taps displayed an old black and white photo. It showed a man, perhaps in his 40s, holding what looked like the same violin. He wore a trench coat and a hat, standing beside a snow-covered brick wall with a faint watermark, Berlin, 1971. What you found, Hensley said gently, wasn't just some war souvenir. Sarah remained silent, watching them closely. That slip of paper, she continued, is an authentic Cold War intelligence memorandum written by a defected East German asset. He vanished in 1973, believed dead. She motioned to Calder, who zoomed in on the image. The paper Sarah had found was now matched on screen side by side with an old file photograph. It was identical. The medal, Calder added, is not a Medal of Valor. It's a coded insignia used only in Operation Orion. Sarah blinked. What's Operation Orion? Now it was Agent Mendez who spoke, low voice but steady. A Black Ops program initiated in 1968 to intercept Soviet military communications during high-alert transitions, troop movement, nuclear readiness, and electronic warfare. Orion used encrypted signals embedded in non-military objects, things less likely to raise suspicion. Musical instruments were one of them. Sarah's eyes widened. You're telling me that violin was used to carry messages? Hensley nodded. Exactly. The code strip you found, it's part of a 3-piece cipher set we thought had been destroyed in 1993. We've had 2 fragments in storage. Yours is the final piece. Sarah stepped back slightly, her breath shallow. And you thought it was gone, destroyed, Calder replied. Officially. When East Germany collapsed, we pulled out. Most of Orion's assets disappeared. The violin you're holding wasn't on any manifest. We assumed it was incinerated with the rest. Mendez approached the counter and looked down at the violin still open on her bench. To think it's been sitting here for decades, disguised as a broken instrument. Sarah shook her head slowly. It came in from a man named Frank Holden. Elderly. He didn't say much, just wanted it to play one last time. The three agents exchanged glances. Hensley stepped closer. Frank D. Holden, you said yes. He's not just a man, she said quietly. He was the courier for the Berlin string, one of three trusted hands in Orion's final phase. He disappeared from our radar after '94. We didn't think he was still alive. Sarah felt as though the air had been knocked from the room. The old man, his voice, his silence, his request. Just once more. Now it made sense. And yet, a new mystery had just opened. If Frank Holden was one of Orion's last couriers, why now? Why this violin, and why bring it back after all these years? Sarah didn't have the answers, but clearly, someone thought she was meant to find them. The federal team didn't linger after the discovery. They were swift, efficient, and carried with them an energy Sarah could only describe as tightly coiled tension. Once the fragments were secured and initial scans completed, Agent Mendez turned back to her with one final question. Do you know where Mr. Frank Holden is now? Sarah paused, her brows furrowed. He never gave me a phone number. No address. Just said he'd be back. The agents exchanged concerned glances. We'll need anything you can recall. Director Hensley said, even the smallest detail. Sarah thought hard. He mentioned nothing directly, but I remember he walked, slowly, like he didn't have far to go. His coat was worn. Looked like something out of the 1960s, but his hands steady, purposeful. That's rare for someone that age. Oh, and his name. He gave it as Frank D. Holden. Not just Frank. Calder typed quickly into his tablet, middle initial D. That matches military records. Born 1936. Served in Army Intelligence Cold War Theater Berlin Station. Sarah's eyes widened. He was really in Berlin. More than that, Mendez muttered. He was embedded in a cultural front, posing as a violin instructor to courier messages. Official records stop after '94. After the team left to trace the leads, Sarah stayed in the quiet of her shop, heart still pounding. Outside, the sky had darkened into a heavy shade of gray, and the wind rattled the old glass panes. She needed to breathe, to think, to ground herself. She moved to the far wall of the shop where dozens of black and white photographs hung in simple wooden frames. They were all musicians, customers who'd left their mark, some smiling, others solemn. She kept them there as a kind of tribute wall. One photo in particular drew her eye now. It had been taken maybe 30 years ago. A man in a heavy coat holding a violin case standing in the very doorway of Whitman's strings. His face was younger, stronger, but the eyes, those eyes. It was him. Frank D. Holden had been here before. She ran her fingers lightly over the frame. Had he been checking in all this time, watching from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to come forward? She didn't know, but it made her chest ache with something more than curiosity. It felt like grief. 2 hours later, Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a number. It was Mendez. We found him, he said. He's at a veterans care facility, Green River Home, just 40 minutes west of you. We're on our way there now. Would you like to come with us? She didn't hesitate. Yes, please. The care home sat nestled in the hills outside of town, a modest, quiet place lined with white fencing and fluttering American flags. Inside, the halls smelled of fresh linen and brewed tea. There were framed medals and faded letters on the walls, signs of a generation that had given much and asked for little. Frank was in the rec room, sitting by the window, staring out at the falling leaves. He turned slowly when he heard footsteps, and his eyes met Sarah's with a kind of soft recognition. You came, he said simply. She nodded, walking toward him as Mendez and Hensley held back. You didn't tell me, Sarah said softly. Frank gave a tired smile. Didn't need to. You found it anyway. She sat beside him, gently setting the violin case between them. It was never mine, he said. It belonged to a man named Anders. We served together in Berlin. He didn't make it home. He paused, swallowing hard. He used that violin to carry the last transmission before everything collapsed. I was supposed to destroy it. I couldn't. So you kept it, Sarah whispered, as a promise, a way to remember him. And what we did, I didn't know anyone would ever find what was inside. Sarah looked down at the case. Why bring it to me now? Frank stared at the trees outside. Because I'm old, because I'm tired, and because secrets don't keep the way they used to. He turned to her, his voice barely more than a breath. I didn't want it to die with me. In that moment, surrounded by fading sunlight and the quiet hum of a room built for forgotten heroes, Sarah understood. The violin wasn't just a relic, it was a testament, a message passed from one generation to another, not through words, but through memory, through trust, and through music. And Frank, he wasn't just delivering a message, he was finally letting go. The ceremony wasn't supposed to be public. Initially, the Department of Defense had planned a quiet acknowledgement, a private thank you visit, a letter, perhaps a medal handed over quietly in a government office. But that changed when Sarah spoke up. This man kept a national secret safe for decades, she told Director Hensley. He carried history in his hands, and not a soul ever knew. Don't you think he deserves more than silence? To her surprise, Hensley agreed. So it was arranged. A modest event, no press, no fanfare, but open to the public and, more importantly, open to veterans. 2 weeks later, under the high ceiling of the Brattleboro Town Hall, nearly 200 chairs were filled with townspeople, servicemen, and women, and quietly curious faces. Some were children. Some were elderly veterans in faded uniforms. And just a few, wore pins and insignias that hadn't seen daylight since the Cold War. At the front of the room stood Frank D. Holden, dressed in a clean gray suit provided by the Veterans Home, with Sarah standing proudly beside him. In his hands was the violin, restored, polished, and whole. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. It was Director Hensley who took the podium first. With a voice steady and solemn, she recounted a version of the story that was safe to share, about a veteran who protected classified intelligence, about a musical instrument used as a tool of peace during times of global tension, and about a promise kept for nearly 50 years. We often celebrate the soldiers on the front lines, she said, but some battles are fought in silence with discipline, patience, and sacrifice that will never make the headlines. Frank D. Holden fought such a battle, and today we remember it. Then she stepped aside, and Sarah came forward holding a single sheet of music. Frank once told me he wanted the violin to play one more time, just once more. The room fell into silence. She placed the sheet music on the stand, picked up the bow, and drew it across the strings. The melody was Shenandoah, simple, pure, full of longing. It wasn't perfect, a soft squeak here, a missed note there, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way Frank looked at the instrument, like he was watching a ghost return home. When the final note faded, there was no applause at first, just a stillness that wrapped around the room like reverence. Then someone stood, then another, and then the entire room rose to their feet. It wasn't clapping they offered, it was respect, a quiet salute, a moment that said, "We see you now." Later, as the crowd slowly left, many stopped to shake Frank's hand. One man, a fellow veteran, offered only a whisper. "You never stopped serving. Thank you." Frank didn't say much that day, but as he sat back in his chair, violin resting gently on his lap, he looked to Sarah and said, "I thought I'd disappear in silence. I never expected to be remembered with music." Sarah smiled. "You didn't just carry a message, Frank. You became one. Some people leave their mark with speeches and medals. Others, like Frank D. Holden, leave it quietly in the hands of those who take the time to listen." Sarah returned to her shop the next morning. The streets of Brattleboro were quiet again, the ceremony over the town back to its gentle rhythm. But something inside Whitman's strings had changed. Above her workbench, where the morning sun slanted through the window, she had framed a photograph of Frank taken just hours after the event. In the photo, he's holding the violin in his lap, his eyes distant, almost peaceful. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Not all heroes speak. Some simply carry the music forward." The violin itself now rested inside a glass case near the front of the shop. Not for sale, not for show, just there as a reminder. A reminder that history doesn't always live in books or museums. Sometimes it waits inside cracked wood, behind quiet eyes, and inside the stories no one ever thought to ask. Sarah often found herself staring at that case when she locked up for the night. And when young students or curious visitors came by, she told them the story. Not every detail, but enough for them to understand that one man carried a message through time, and that a violin, something fragile, delicate, had protected it longer than anyone believed possible. In the end, it wasn't about espionage or secrets. It was about memory, about duty, About one man's quiet promise to a fallen friend and the power of music to hold on to what history forgets. So if you're watching this and wondering whether the small things you do matter, remember Frank. And remember that sometimes the softest echoes carry the deepest truths. Have you ever known someone like Frank, someone whose story almost disappeared? Share it into the comments. Let's make sure these quiet legacies are never lost again. And if this story moved you, like, subscribe, and help us preserve more untold voices. Because some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. Some just leave behind a song,